much for joining us tonight. My name is Becca Bertrand. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society. And before we get started, I first want to thank Charter Books so much for being our partner this evening. And before we begin, even though he really doesn't need an introduction, I'll read Rick's bio. Rick Atkinson is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 7 previous works of history, including The Long Gray Line, The Liberation Trilogy, An Army at Dawn, The Day of Battle, and The Guns at Last Light, and The British Are Coming, his first volume of the Revolution Trilogy. Atkinson worked as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor for 2 decades at the Washington Post, also is an avid gardener, I just learned. He has won numerous awards, including Pulitzer Prizes for history and journalism. And his latest book, The Fate of the Day, which I think you either have in your hands or you're going to get later, is officially, as of either today or yesterday, a New York Times #1 bestseller. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me here, Becca. I like your weather.
We made it especially for you.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah.
So I know that everyone here has a lot of questions themselves, and I have some myself, but if you just hold your questions to the end, that would be greatly appreciated. But I think we'll just dive right in. Having meticulously covered the European theater in World War II and other periods, what drew you to this specific period of the American Revolution for your next major work?
Thank you for that. Yeah, well, I spent 15 years writing about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And I've written now 8 books about 5 American wars, most of them more recent than the 18th century. And I spent a lot of time as a journalist, mainly for the Washington Post, with our contemporary military, particularly the Army, in places like Somalia and Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. And I think I was interested in understanding the origins of this military that I'd been writing about for so long. I've always been interested in the Revolution since I was a kid, 8th grade at George S. Patton Junior High School in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. My father was an Army officer. I can remember reading for the first time about Benedict Arnold, and I thought, well, what an interesting dude this is. So like many of you, I think I grew up being curious about the Revolution and believing that it tells us something about who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and what they were willing to die for, which is the most profound question any people can ask themselves. So when I finished the World War II stuff, which was 2013, I thought of Jack London's advice that a writer ought not sit back and wait for inspiration, but ought to light out after it with a club. And I took my club, and what I found was a revolution.
But I'm so interested in that because as a researcher, it's an incredibly different kind of research, you know, researching 20th century history and then researching the 18th century. How did you overcome those kinds of challenges, or was it any different for you?
Yeah, it's very different. The archives are all different. All the archives that I had felt like I had mastered for World War II are basically worthless for the Revolution.
Right.
And it's a whole different set of places you need to go. So, for example, where's the greatest repository of 18th century material relating to British generals and British statesmen for the Revolutionary period? It's in Ann Arbor. You may know that Michigan was not one of the 13 colonies. But there was an industrialist, Michigan industrialist and collector named William Clements, and he began buying up the papers of British generals and statesmen from their families. So, for example, the papers of George Germain, Lord George Germain, who was the American secretary. He's the Robert McNamara of the war for the Brits. His papers are in Ann Arbor. The papers of a number of the senior generals in the war, including Henry Clinton. He's the commanding general for the longest period of the American Revolution. His papers are in Ann Arbor. So I had to learn those archives, Massachusetts Historical Society, the Huntington Library in California, they've got a great collection. You know, it's the World War II archive generally is massive. The papers for the United States Army alone, one service, one country, weigh 17,000 tons. It's a lot of paper. There were 16.1 million Americans in uniform in World War II, 130 million people in this country. Soldiers were forbidden to keep diaries as a security precaution, so they all kept diaries, naturally. Soldiers being soldiers. And there's an extraordinary trove of letters and diaries and all of the things that you can extract to humanize the inhuman. There's not that kind of trove for the revolution, obviously. The country at that time had only 2.5 million people. 500,000 of them were enslaved blacks. It's a very literate country at that time, much more literate than England, actually. But you don't have the surviving letters, diaries, and so on. There's some, and they're important. And the papers of the founders are very beautifully curated for the most part. But it's a challenge. And the last thing about it is that there's so many who leave no footprints. Mostly women. I wish there were 10 Abigail Adamses, because she's the smartest of the bunch. She's as good a writer as any of them, and she's a witness. But they're not. There's only one. So women, blacks, Indians, they leave almost no trace. And that's something that's difficult to tease out of the historical record.
I absolutely agree with you. And the Newport Historical Society strongly believes in advocating for underrepresented voices. And just a plug for us, we do a partner version of our journal, our peer-reviewed journal. And the next one, the 2026 version called The Bridge, is done in partnership with Rhode Island Historical Society. And if you're interested in learning more of those stories, this will be about underrepresented voices in the revolution. So that is something that's incredibly challenging for researchers to discuss and learn more about. Switching topics a little bit, The Fate of the Day is covering a pivotal but often a less discussed period of the war, other than these kind of key larger battles like Saratoga. Which key aspects of this particular time frame, because you're going from, in this book, from 1777 to 1780, are you thinking are the most crucial for understanding the ultimate American victory?
Yeah. Well, I opened the book not in Rhode Island, but in Versailles. And we meet immediately King Louis XVI and his beautiful Austrian spendthrift queen, Marie Antoinette, known around the French court as Madame Deficit. And the reason that we start there is because at this point, this is the spring of 1777, the game is really to try to get the French to come into the war on behalf of the rebels, let's say us. It's a heavy diplomatic lift to persuade a Catholic absolute monarch to throw in his lot with Protestant wannabe Republicans determined to wage war against their lawful monarch. And the guy who is given the task of accomplishing this is Benjamin Franklin. So he also appears in the prologue because he is sent to France. He's arrived in December 1776 as our first and greatest, as it turns out, diplomat, and his job is to persuade the French. We need the French help. Without the French help, it's not clear that we're going to win. And it is clear that the war will go on and on and on without the French help. At the same time, at the same period in the spring of 1777, April precisely, we meet a spindly, red-headed 19-year-old, one of the richest boys in France, named Gilbert du Motier. You know him better as the Marquis de Lafayette. Because he has become inflamed with a passion for what he believes to be the struggle that's going on in America for the rights of man. And despite the fact that King Louis has told him not to leave France, he's going to leave France. He buys a ship, he has a small group of boon companions, and he's going to sail from Bordeaux and arrive here. So we meet these people early on in the book, and it's because you have to understand, I think, what's going on in France in order to understand how things play out over the next several years. I spend a lot of time in London and elsewhere in Britain trying to understand the other side of the hill. Why is George III determined to wage war against his own people for 8 years, as it turns out, across 3,000 miles of open ocean? That's a pretty fundamental question. And I spent a lot of time with George III's papers and trying to understand the British point of view. So the war, it goes from being this, sputtering brush fire on the edge of the civilized world to a global war in the span of this book, fought on 4 continents in the 7 seas. And I think understanding why that happens, why the French come into it, why the Spanish come into it, the Dutch are going to come into it. And it becomes an existential struggle, not just for Americans trying to secure independence, but for the British, because they're now fighting the Bourbon powers. And at one point in this book, there's a very large armada, bigger than the 1588 armada, of French and Spanish warships off the southern coast of England, determined to invade Portsmouth and possibly march on London. It becomes that kind of war. And so laying this out and trying to understand the international aspects of it is as important as Brandywine, Germantown, Bennington, Saratoga, Newport, and on and on.
And, I think that touches on it precisely, that it's a very complicated story. And what you do so well through this book and your previous book is tell that complicated story also with really beautiful profiles of different individuals. And I think that that method is something very similar to what we do with some of our exhibitions. And my second shameless plug for the Historical Society is that our next exhibition, which opens next Thursday on the 15th, Newport 1775, Whose Side Are You On, is doing just that, where we're profiling 6 individuals throughout Newport and really asking you to learn more about these people, because the war is really about people and their choices. So I'm curious, having read the book and read about so many different individuals, if there were anyone who stood out as particularly surprising or intriguing throughout your research, and what made their story stand out. I guess not, do you have a favorite, but do you have
I
a
love
favorite?
all my children equally. And if you're going to give a plug, it better be shameless, otherwise it's not worth it.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many intriguing figures from that period. You could not make it up. There is no novelist who could, Tolstoy couldn't do this. I'll talk about one, and he's a hometown hero to you all. And I spend a lot of time with him in this book, and I'm going to spend a lot of time with him in the final book, and that's Nathaniel Greene. Proud lapsed Quaker from Coventry, I think, isn't that where he's from? Anchor Smith. He's second only to Washington as the indispensable man in the Continental Army. He's such some of you know this story, he's such an extraordinary figure. Washington has a great eye for subordinate talent. He has a lot of defects as a general. He's not a very good tactician frequently. He's got a molten temper. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. But he does have a great eye for subordinate talent. So when the Continental Army is gathering for the first time, and Washington arrives July 2nd, 1775 to take command, he sees an overweight 25-year-old Boston bookseller named Henry Knox, and somehow intuits this guy's going to be the father of American artillery. He's a brilliant gunner. And at the same time, he sees this guy from Rhode Island. He's 36, I think, then. Now, as some of you know, he ran for lieutenant of his militia company In those days, you elected your company officers and lost. He lost the election. So he's still a private, and he lost in part, it's said, because he had a tricky knee, and he had a bit of a hobble when he walked, and the men of the company didn't want this gimpy guy in the front of the company making him look bad. Well, he had political connections in Rhode Island, right? And so Rhode Island, the assembly makes him brigadier general. He goes from private to brigadier general overnight. So this is when Washington meets him, and Washington recognizes in him some of the same traits that Washington has. A big brain, organized for executive action, willing to take responsibility, willing to make decisions, capable of keeping enormous amounts of minutia straight and straightening it out when it's not straight. So Greene is going to be valuable right from the get-go as an advisor, as a field commander, and then two other roles that are absolutely indispensable in winning the war. First, in the awful winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge. It was awful, not so much because it was cold. It wasn't that cold that winter in eastern Pennsylvania, and it didn't snow that much. But more than 2,000 American soldiers died at Valley Forge of malnutrition, of disease. It was hideous. The army's coming apart. The supply system is collapsing. Washington turns to Greene and says, I need you to be my quartermaster general. Greene says, I don't want to. Nobody in history has ever heard of a quartermaster general, quote unquote. He tells this to Washington. He writes it to Washington. Washington says, you gotta. I need you to do this. And so, being loyal to Washington, being loyal to the cause, he becomes quartermaster general, and he's brilliant at it. He helps to save that army at Valley Forge, and he's going to be quartermaster general for 2 years, and he's really, really excellent at it. We get to 1780, and the war really has begun to shift to the south. And the last several years of the war are almost entirely in the south. The last big battle in the north is at Monmouth, hometown of Bruce Springsteen, in northern New Jersey, and then it's all in the south. And the field commander in the south is going to be Nathaniel Greene. And he really shows his chops as a field commander then. He leads the British, particularly Cornwallis, who's a very good general, one of the few certifiably capable British generals. Cornwallis is chasing him all over the Carolinas, Virginia, and although Greene is not at the end game, when the war is essentially won at Yorktown, he has set up victory at Yorktown. So, Nathaniel Greene, and he's so interesting. He marries Cotty Little. She's from Block Island. She's fantastic. Washington is, I think, quite smitten with her. She's very good looking. She's a flirt. She's smart. She speaks French. Washington does not. Washington is rarely is not known for his sense of humor. You go look at that Gilbert Stewart picture in there. This is not a guy who's, slapping his knee and telling jokes. But at one point, he says to Greene, they're in winter quarters. This is 1779, I think. They're in winter quarters, and to keep the officers entertained, they throw parties or dances and whatever. And Cotty is there. The wives of the senior officers are often there for the winter, like Martha Washington is there more often than not. And Washington spends 3 hours dancing with Cotty, and tells Cotty that he's thinking of stealing her from your Quaker preacher husband. That's as close to ribald as it ever gets. So anyway, they're just fantastic. And the last thing I'll say about him is, so why is he not better remembered? You know who he is. Most people don't in this country. And it's because he has a tragic fate. After the war, he should have been one of the founders. He should have participated in the Constitutional Convention. Henry Knox becomes the first Secretary of War. Why isn't Greene there elevated to position? It's because he's dead. He's been given, as a consequence of his service to the country, confiscated loyalist plantations from Georgia. So he and Cotty moved to Georgia. He's out one hot summer day. Guy from Rhode Island doesn't realize how hot it gets. He doesn't have a hat on, no sunblock, and he sunstroke gets him and he dies. They say it's 1788, I think. So it's just before the Constitutional Convention, and so he's kind of been lost, I think, to history. He's buried in Savannah. We ought not forget him. He's very important. So he's one of many, many characters that intrigue me.
That's great. I was surprised by that. I didn't think that was who you were going to pick. That's interesting. I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about actual combat. I'm not a military historian, so I was very interested to hear about the use of the bayonet. Can you tell the audience a bit more about how it was employed, mostly by the British in tactics? You know, I know that by the Civil War, you don't see much of that used in battle successfully because it's not as effective. But I'm interested to hear you talk about that because I think there's some statistics that I found to be kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah. Well, 18th century muskets are mostly inaccurate beyond 80 yards, and they're almost hopeless beyond 100 yards. And so killing in the 18th century in battles is very different from the 21st century. It's very intimate, often face-to-face, often with a bayonet. For example, the inaccuracy of the musket can be seen on the first day of the war, April 19th, 1775, when the British famously marched to Lexington. They kill 8 Americans on Lexington Green. They march to Concord. Concord is ready for them. They end up fleeing back to Boston and being harassed every step of the way. And it's been calculated that the 4,000 or so militiamen who rallied to the Patriot cause and were in actual combat against the British on that day fired about collectively 75,000 rounds. But only one round in every 300 actually hit a red coat. So the shot heard round the world probably missed. And as a consequence of and the last thing I'll say about musketry, when you have groups of men firing together, volleys and these 1-ounce lead slugs flying 1,000 feet a second downrange, it can be a 1-ounce lead slug will stop a charging bull. And so that can be deadly. But typically what the British would do is they would fire and then they would charge with bayonets. And they had practiced this over and over again. And they employed these tactics in the 7 Years' War. We call it the French and Indian War. And they were really good at it. And it's terrifying. It's one of the reasons why some of them wear tall hats. It makes them look bigger and fiercer. The Americans often had no training with a bayonet. They often did not have bayonets. This is one of the things that happens at Valley Forge. There's a lot of bayonet training along with other training going on there. And the Americans eventually get pretty good at it. One thing the Americans do have, not many of them, but enough to really worry the British, is rifles. Now, rifles different from a musket. It's got grooves cut into the bore, and it makes the bullet spin, which makes it more stable, and it's much more accurate than a musket. And there are relatively few of them. The rifle is harder to load. It takes longer to load, and when somebody's coming at you with a bayonet, you're trying to get the bullet jammed in, and it won't carry a bayonet. But the British recognized early on that riflemen, many of them were from Virginia, Pennsylvania, that's where a lot of the rifles are made, were targeting the brightest of the red coats that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. And so they're deliberately targeting officers, because if you kill the officers or you maim the officers, the unit begins to disintegrate. The British thought this was terribly unfair. This is really, really, they complained about it a lot. This is really unfair. But it happened a lot. It happens at Saratoga and elsewhere. So these nuances of 18th century warfare are something that we, the Americans, had to grow into. They didn't know how to maneuver on the battlefield. It's very important that when you want to go left, you want to go left together. When you want to go right, you want to go right together. All of these things had to be learned. A lot of that learning happened at Valley Forge.
Great. Well, since we're in Newport, let's talk about Newport.
Yeah.
I think your chapter on the Battle of Rhode Island is extraordinary, and it's a very complicated battle, but I think you make it very clear and concise and easy to understand, which is not an easy thing to do because there's so much happening. So, I'd love to hear your perspective. I mean, obviously we think that Newport played the most important role in the American Revolution. But, I'm interested in your take.
You think I'm going to deny that in this room?
Good luck getting out, Rick.
Yeah.
No, but I am really interested in, your perspective on Newport's role. Since you've studied the entire war, and I know you're about to start writing the third. Are you researching the third? About to start writing the third?
Yeah.
You taking a break?
About to start writing it?
Okay.
No. You sound like a publisher. Yeah, well, Newport is important. The British recognize Narragansett Bay as, there are British admirals who think it's the finest anchorage in North America. So it's captured, as you know, in the winter of 76, 77. The British don't have much trouble coming in here and seizing Newport and controlling the bay and the approaches to the bay. And it's partly because they want a winter anchorage for the Royal Navy. Now, the Royal Navy is the greatest Navy the world's ever seen. There are about 400 warships, and they're terrifyingly good. So they own New York at this point, and New York Bay is a lot more difficult than Narragansett Bay to enter and exit. There are shoals. It's really tricky. You really have to know what you're doing. Here, you got a lot of islands, but it's an easier, I'm told, I'm not a sailor, but from what I read and what I'm told by sailors, this is an easier place to get in and out of. So they have Rhode Island. They have this part of Rhode Island. It's going to get really interesting when the French come into the war. We talked about why it's important for the French, and they come in, and what do? They send a fleet. And they send a fleet here under an admiral named D'Estaing. Unfortunately, he's not a very good admiral. And one of the reasons he's not a very good admiral is because he's been a general before he was an admiral. Only the French would allow men who are generals to switch services. So D'Estaing's been a general. They make him an admiral. And they make him the admiral in charge of the fleet that's on the North American station. He's also unlucky. That's a bad combination. He doesn't know how to sail, and he's not lucky. So he comes here, and there's going to be an encounter. I'm telling you something you already know. There's going to be an encounter between the fleet that D'Estaing has here and an American force. D'Estaing also has some soldiers on his ships. They're going to be landed here in Newport, and the idea is that an American army, Lafayette, is helping to coordinate this, and other American officers who speak French, including Alexander Hamilton, he's an aide to Washington, and John Lawrence, who's from Charleston. His father is the president of the Continental Congress, succeeds Hancock. They're all here. And they're all here trying to coordinate an attack on this British enclave. Because if you can seize back Newport and you can seize back the anchorage, then it's good because we don't have New York. Well, what happens is that D'Estaing is here. He forces his way into the bay, and things are looking good. And there's an American force coming. Greene is part of that force. He's given field command. And they're more or less surrounding this part of this island. What happens? The British Navy shows up. D'Estaing's fleet is inside the bay. They're getting ready, and they've already begun landing some of the troops. They're getting ready to attack right where we are now. And a Royal Navy fleet appears right off the coast. And what's worse, it's commanded by Lord Richard Howe, one of the greatest fighting sea dogs in the history of the Royal Navy. He's not a guy you want to tangle with because he really knows what he's doing, unlike D'Estaing. D'Estaing orders all of his troops back onto the ships. It is one big scramble drill. There's been a lot of cannonading back and forth between the British guns that are here. It's pretty intense. And the French guns are firing, and it's very panoramic. And the French fleet sails back out of the bay, and the British fleet under Howe turn around and they start out into the Atlantic. D'Estaing gives chase. You can stand out here on the hills and watch him, as most of the people of Newport are doing. It doesn't get more dramatic than this, and then they disappear over the horizon. And what happens? One of the greatest summer storms in the history of New England happens. Maybe it's a hurricane. It certainly has hurricane force. And just as the fleets are beginning to close with each other to have a major fleet action, the storm hits and discombobulates everything. It damages the British fleet. It really wrecks the French fleet. So D'Estaing's flagship, it's a 100-gun ship. It's one of the biggest sailing vessels the French have ever built. It's completely dismasted. All three masts snap off. And that's not the only ship that's dismasted. They limp back here, and the storm hits here. All of the tents of the American troops here are flattened. It's really bad. It's a terrible storm. The fleet comes back. The French fleet comes back here. The British fleet goes back to New York for repairs and to get reinforcements. D'Estaing comes back and tells the Americans here, John Sullivan is the general commanding, I got to leave. I'm going to Boston. My fleet, look out there. See any masts? I got to go to Boston to get my ships repaired. There is a huge to-do about it. John Sullivan, who is an intemperate, unlucky general, why Washington hangs on to him is a mystery to me. He's very undiplomatic, and he says nasty things about the French. This is at a time when the game is to keep the French on our side. So D'Estaing sails away to Boston. The effort to evict the British from Newport fails. The British are going to come back to Newport shortly afterward with another fleet. Some of it, Howe's fleet is chasing D'Estaing to Boston. He never quite catches him. But there's yet another fleet that shows up here, and it chases the besieging American force here away. They have to leave because they're outgunned, they're outmanned. And that's the end of the effort to retake Newport at that time. Washington is crestfallen because you're this close to winning, and it doesn't happen. So it's a spectacular part of the revolution, and it's yet another example of where the contingencies of war are always extraordinary, and the contingencies of weather are part of that.
Just like tonight.
Right.
So the American Revolution obviously is not just a military conflict, but also a social and a political upheaval. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how this is playing out during the middle years of the war. between 77 and 80? Because I think we hear a lot about leading up to the war and then a lot about after the war, but how are things shifting in the middle of the war, or is there anything, socially, politically changing?
Well, the thing to remember about all 8 years, and it certainly intensifies in these middle years, is that it is a civil war.
Mm.
It's our first civil war, and it's just as nasty as every civil war is. So it's a civil war on several levels. Obviously, it's the mother country in Britain fighting against other Britons. We still think of ourselves in 1775 as Britons. More intensely, more important, is it's a civil war, American on American. Modern scholarship shows that about 20% of the 2 million white Americans remain loyal to the crown. It's more or less steadfastly. That's about 400,000 out of the 2 million. That's never enough to control the levers of power. None of the 13 states are controlled by loyalists after 1775. They don't have national leaders. They don't have good propaganda. The rebels are brilliant at propaganda. They require massive British support wherever they are, either militarily or for civil reasons. But the Civil War plays out in ways that become more and more ugly. So that if you are a loyalist, or even if you're just a fence straddler, unsure of the propriety of waging rebellion against your lawful monarch, you are subjected to dreadful treatment, expropriation, jailing, beating, torture, even execution on occasion. This, of course, intensifies the animus between loyalists and rebels. And it intensifies as the war goes on, so that we're going to see, especially when the war gets into the South, it's as ugly as civil wars get. That's the underpinnings of it. It plays out in other ways too. It becomes kind of a civil war in the Native American communities. Mm-hmm. 6 nations of the Iroquois have been getting along pretty well together for 100 years. They have a kind of compact in which they don't raid each other, but when the revolution begins, they have to pick sides. And 4 of those 6 nations, like the Mohawk, basically align with the British. 2 others align with the Americans. And so there's Indian fighting Indian as part of it. The Indians get the short stick always in the revolution. It's very nasty. Washington is an old Indian fighter. He has no love for the Indians. He spends most of 1779 planning a reprisal campaign against the Iroquois in upstate New York, where they burn 40. He doesn't lead it, but he puts the same John Sullivan, who's been here, in command of that expedition. They burn 40 villages. The Indians are basically pushed back up to the St. Lawrence. It's like that. That's what the war is like. So that's what's playing out. Slavery is the inescapable issue. You all here in Rhode Island know that it is part of what formed the prosperity of Rhode Island. It's a big subject, and I won't dwell on it, but the question of whether to arm slaves appears on both sides. The royal governor of Virginia, early on, announces that any slave who escapes from a rebel plantation or a rebel household will be given arms and a kind of uniform and enrolled in what's called the Ethiopian Regiment, and then given his freedom afterwards. This does not apply to slaves who escape from loyalists. It does not apply to the 40 slaves that Governor Dunmore, the royal governor, owns. But this enrages the planters of the South, Washington foremost. Nothing angers him more in the war than this gesture and it's very ineffective. Those slaves who escape, they contract smallpox. It's a very sad story. The Americans, under particularly John Laurens, the son of Henry Laurens, President of Congress, has been the largest slave trader in America. That's where his great wealth comes from, in Charleston. He's retired now. He's dabbling in politics. His son has been educated in Switzerland and Britain, and he's an abolitionist. And he tries to persuade his father that the best way to make up the manpower deficits in the Continental Army is to arm slaves with the understanding that they will be given their freedom at the end of the war. Pretty good plan. Henry finally says, "Okay, try it." He calls it your pipe dream. Washington really doesn't want to think about it. But Washington finally agrees too. If you can make this happen, fine. But you got to get South Carolina to agree, because the war at this point, Charleston is being besieged. John Laurens goes back to his native Charleston. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he is told not only no by the city fathers and the leaders of South Carolina, he's told, hell no, get out of here. We will never do that. And so it doesn't happen. So this is part of the social underpinnings of the war.
Thank you. As you were researching this book and the one before, were there any sort of prevailing myths or misconceptions about this period during the Revolution that you were seeking to address or to clarify with your books?
Yeah, I mean, the founders are embalmed in reverence or yes. Condemned for their manifest flaws. The mythology is very thick. And a lot of the things that we learned in school is wrong. The image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to grab his musket from above the mantle and go off in defense of freedom is mostly mythical. Yes, there were embattled farmers at Concord Bridge, April 19th, 1775. But after 1775, a lot of the enthusiasm for the cause begins to ebb away. And that initial Continental Army that's forming in Massachusetts, which does include a lot of freeholders and merchants and so on, they've got to go back to their shops and their farms and their families that they've been ignoring. And so the army increasingly becomes, in 1777 onward, a very different composition. It is the landless young. It is the unattached. It is the immigrants, including a lot of Irish who've come here because of crop failures and a collapse of the weaving industry in Ireland. A very large contingent of Irish in the Continental Army. It's anybody who needs the $6 a month you get paid as a private. And so that army is a lot different than the one that we typically think of. It's a challenge for Washington, who's also heavily mythified. It's a challenge for Washington because he's got to, first of all, weld them into a legitimate fighting force, one that can face British bayonets. And he's also got to persuade them that the cause is something that they are in together. When Washington first gets to Cambridge in July 1775, he's a Virginian. He's been sent to command the army, partly because he looks the part. He's 6'3", looks great on a horse, greatest horseman of his age, according to Jefferson. He commands every room that he comes into. And he's had 5 years of pretty substantial military experience, including a lot of combat, as a militia colonel, always under superior British command in the French and Indian War. Okay, so this Virginian is sent to form a Continental Army. Now, the army is mostly New Englanders, right? but it's a recruiting tool. Maybe other Southerners will come and join. And it's a gesture of continental unity. He comes up here, and Rhode Island is a different country from Virginia. Massachusetts is a different country. They're not just different states. And he privately talks about dirty New Englanders. He's got nothing good to say about New Englanders. He's very disparaging of the junior officers who show up. So one of the things that has to happen with him, and it's a tribute to his capabilities as a commander, one of the reasons he ultimately is a war-winning general, is he's got to recognize the sacrifice these men have been making to leave their shops and their farms and their families. He's got to build that mystical bond between leader and led that is so vital in any organization, but particularly in a military organization in the war. And he does. That's one of the things that we see happening with Washington over the middle years of the war. And he's got to persuade these troops, including these guys who are in it just for the $6 a month, that he knows in his bones, so that they'll know in their bones that they are in it together. They're sharing the same hardships. They believe in the same ultimate vision of where this is going. So that's all what's happening on a social level in the middle years of the war.
Well, just one more question from me, and then we'll get to a few from the audience. What lessons or insights, I guess, from this period of American history do you think are the most relevant for modern readers?
How about for modern citizens?
Yeah, that works. Yes.
Okay, here's what I believe. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation. And it includes personal liberties and strictures on how to divide power and keep it from concentrating in the hands of authoritarians who think primarily of themselves. So we can't let that priceless gift slip away. We cannot allow it to be taken away. And we cannot be oblivious to this extraordinary heritage that we've got, or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it over the past 250 years. That's what I think. And I hope that people looking back on the revolution intuit that and come to that same recognition as part of what the bequest from the revolution to us is.
Thank you. Thank you. So we got a couple of pre-submitted questions, and we went through them beforehand to see how they fit with some of the other questions, and some were exactly the same we had pre-prepared. So one did come in that we wanted to go through. Considering your access to the Georgian archives, what was it like putting yourself in the mind of King George III?
Oh, boy. This is one of my favorite topics. So I think it's important to be on the other side of the hill to see what were the British thinking. And I was telling Becca, in late 2015, Queen Elizabeth II, now the late Queen Elizabeth II, opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owned, as part of a project to digitize and catalog the papers of all four Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th century. Most of those papers, are about 500,000 pages, are from the reign of George III, your last king, because he was king for almost 60 years. And most of them had been previously unpublished. So I was among the first allowed in to take a look. And every morning I would flash my badge at the Henry VIII gate to get into Windsor Castle, which is about 20 miles west of London. And I'd flash my badge again at the Norman Gate, and I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers. That's where they're kept. And George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. And he wrote his correspondence himself for the most part, and he made the copies himself. And so you have a tactile sense of being in his presence. I was there for a whole month and felt like I got to know George pretty well as a man and as a monarch. He is not the royal brute that Thomas Paine calls him in Common Sense, published in January 1776. He's not the tyrant that Jefferson calls him in the Declaration of Independence. He's not the sinister ninny who prances across the stage in Hamilton every night, singing, "You'll be back." He is a constitutional monarch, a patriot king, child of the Enlightenment. He's a substantial supporter of both the arts and the sciences. The 65,000 books in his personal library form the basis for the British Library, one of the great libraries of the world. He marries an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, Virginia. She learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord on the voyage from Germany to England. They married 6 hours after they met. He had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish. Because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. It was a loving marriage. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to the number of 15. And you see in this correspondence, George is a caring parent. He cares about his kids. But, however, the war he wages, he's stubborn, he's sometimes brutal, and he embraces several strategic misconceptions. This is where I'm inside his head, and I can see how he's thinking. And we'll talk about his madness at the end here. He believes, and his government believes, and a majority of Parliament, House of Commons, House of Lords, believe that a majority of the 2 million white Americans here are actually loyal to the crown. That's not true. He believes that the rebels will be intimidated by superior British firepower. That's not true. And he believes, probably most catastrophically, that if the American colonies are permitted to detach themselves from the British Empire, it will encourage insurrections in Ireland, Canada, India, the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, and that's where the real money is. And it'll be the beginning of the end of the British Empire, which is a new construct. It comes out of British victory over the French and Spanish in the 7 Years' War in 1763. And he's not going to let that happen on his watch. And in 1781, he is so determined that the war persists, even after Yorktown, that he drafts a letter of abdication in case his government refuses to pursue the war against the Americans as vigorously as he wants. Complicated guy. The last thing about his, The Madness of King George was a play, and then it became a movie, and there's a widespread presumption that he's nuts through the Revolution. It's not true. It was thought at one time that he had porphyria, which is a blood disease that can cause imbalances in the brain. The first episode of this bizarre behavior of his is brief. It's in the 1760s, not long after he becomes king. The Queen hushes it up. People don't know what it is. They don't know how to diagnose it. He's bipolar. And it's going to, throughout the entire revolution, he's fine. He's a little, he's a little obsessive compulsive, but he's fine. He's mentally sound. In 1788, he has another episode and it lasts for 4 months. And he is so unbalanced, so bizarre in his behavior, talks incessantly, becomes violent. They have to put him in a straitjacket. And it passes. After 4 months, he recovers. And, the doctors, medicine is not worthy of the name. And they do what they usually do. They bleed him over and over again. And they put leeches on him. So when the French Revolution begins and the Napoleonic Wars begin, he's okay then. And that's important. You need a monarch because it's an existential war against France. In 1804, it happens again. And again, it's a months-long thing. Again, they use straitjackets. And again, he recovers. In 1810, it happens and he never recovers. And the last 10 years of his life are absolutely horrible. The Queen comes to see him. This is a loving marriage. She comes to see him for the last time, I think it's in 1812, for 15 minutes. She never sees him again. He grows his long white beard and grows his hair out. He looks like Lear. He acts like Lear. And he dies of pneumonia in 1820. His eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who becomes George IV, takes over as regent in 1810. He's a terrible king. He's a terrible son. But that's the end of George. And it's a great tragic arc to his life.